To order the Committee of the Whole on the first biennial budget for Cuyahoga County. This is week 6 of the budget process. And the clerk will please call the roll.
Calling the roll, Mr. Jones. Here. Mr. Rogers. Here. Ms. Simon. Mr. Greenspan.
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Here.
Mr. Brady.
Present.
Mr. Germana.
Here.
Mr. Gallagher.
Here.
Mr. Schron.
Here.
Ms. Conwell.
Here.
Ms. Conley.
Here.
The quorum.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, do we have anybody who has signed in for public comment?
Mr. Chair, yes, we do. The first one to address council is Orlando Howard.
Mr. Howard, please step forward. You have 3 minutes to address the council. And when you hear the sound of the bell, if you've not finished, then just take a sentence or two to wrap up your remarks. And please proceed. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and members of the council, my name is Orlando Howard, Clinical Manager of St. Vincent's Charity Medical Center, Rosary Hall. I would like to begin by telling you a true story. First, I would like you all to sit back and close your eyes. Please, close your eyes. I am going to tell you a story about a mother whose daughter was addicted to alcohol and drugs. She was a beautiful daughter, educated, and liked by many, and very much loved by her family. Can you see her? She began using drugs at the age of 33, and one night she was missing from her home. The Cleveland police and her family searched for her for 10 days. Can you see them? On the 10th day, the detectives came to her mother's house and informed her that they had found a body and asked if she would come to the coroner's office to identify the body. Can you see her mother? It was the body of her 34-year-old daughter. Can you see the pain and devastation on her face? But the mother also had another problem. Her 30-year-old son was addicted and suffering from depression. She feared losing him to this fatal disease of addiction. Can you see her? Her son was homeless, living from household to household, eating where he could and having people tell him no, and that he would never amount to anything. Can you see him? One day, after 4 years of battling this terrible addiction, his mother's daily prayers were answered. He walked into a treatment center and asked for help. They did not tell him no. They welcomed him and told him that they would help him. Can you see him? 1 year later, on Mother's Day, 1992, her son presented his mother with his first year sobriety anniversary certificate. Can you see them? The following year, in 1993, his mother was dying from cancer. And before she died, she told her son, "Son, please do what them people in that treatment center told you to do." And she passed that day on Mother's Day. Can you see her? Her son went on to college and made the dean's list 2 years in a row. He was inducted into Phi Theta Kappa's International Honor Society with a GPA of 3.8. He later studied for the Ohio Chemical Dependency Professionals Board state licensure test and became a licensed counselor. Can you see him? He was a board member at a transitional housing program for women. Can you see him? In 2004, at the Cuyahoga County's Community Mental Health Board Providers Recognition Employee Service ceremony, he was awarded the Direct Service Worker Award. Can you see him? In his career, he was promoted several times, and his last promotion was 5 months ago. Can you see him? You can open your eyes now. He is in this room. Can you see him? My mother says thank you for saving her son's life. His name is Orlando Howard, and he is the Chemical Dependency Clinical Manager for St. Vincent's Charity Medical Center, Rosary Hall. We are asking for our budget to be restored because without it, 162 patients will be told no. Treatment works and people do recover. I did. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Madam Clerk.
The next speaker is Kelly Cover.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Kelly, and first I would like to say I have a disease of addiction, which is no different than diabetes or cancer. I'm here to tell you how important Rosary Hall is to me. I've been using drugs off and on for 30 years. I come from a long line of addicts. This disease was passed down to me, and I've passed it down to my children. My addiction, however, took off for me in 1990 when I was introduced to painkillers. Since then, I've been in and out of prison and rehabs. Before coming to Rosary Hall, I was shooting about 10 to 15 bags a day. I was homeless on the streets, weighing 90 pounds, and I was spiritually, emotionally, and financially bankrupt. Due to this disease, I no longer cared about anything except my next fix. I did a lot of things I'm not proud of in order to get my drugs. I lost everything that I ever cared about. My marriage, my kids, my friends, my family, especially myself. I have a brain disease that literally sucked the life out of me. One day I found myself in a dope house. I'd been up for days, and it was a few hours after being raped. I was putting a needle in my arm, and I prayed to God to please save my life. I didn't want to die a junkie. Well, in walked this couple that I hadn't seen in a couple weeks, and there was something different about them. There was a light in their eyes. They were just there to get some clothes that they left there, and I remember needing to know what was different. I was drawn to the hope in their eyes. I asked them to stay and get high with me, and they said they no longer got high. They just got out of Rosary Hall. They told me that I could go too, that it didn't matter that I didn't have insurance or money. They gave me Rosary Hall's number and left. Today, I call those people my angels. 2 weeks later, when my disease brought me to my knees, I called Rosary Hall. 2 days after that, on a Thursday, I went to orientation, and I called every day for 2.5 weeks, till finally on June 6th, my bed and detox was available. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt hope. This was the first time a judge didn't send me. I didn't do this for my husband or my kids. I did this because I didn't want to die. Today I know God has a plan and a purpose for me. Rosary Hall saved my life. I've lost a lot of people due to this disease, and last week I almost lost my son to an overdose. I know if I would have kept using, I would be dead. Rosary Hall has helped me restore my relationship with God, and it helped me surrender to a 12-step spiritual program of recovery. They equip me with the tools that I use every day to keep this disease under arrest. Today I live in Transitional House at Hitchcock Center for Women. I'm job hunting and about to start classes at Cleveland State to become a substance abuse counselor for teens. I know today none of this would be possible without God's mercy and Rosary Hall. I just pray that when my son hits his bottom and wants help, that this will be available to him too. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We welcome Councilwoman Simon to the committee. Madam Clerk, do we have anyone else signed in for public comment? Thank you very much. My colleagues, in your packet are the minutes for the meetings of November 7th and November 9th. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes for November 7th?
So moved.
Second. It's been moved by Council President Connolly and seconded by Councilman Schron to approve the minutes for November 7th. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. The minutes of November 7th are approved. Is there a motion to approve the minutes for November 9th?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved by Councilman Jones and seconded by Councilperson Conwell to approve the minutes for November 9th. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it, and the minutes for November 9th are approved as written. We move on to item number 5, matters referred to committee. Ms. Clerk, would you read the resolution?
Resolution number 2011-0291, a resolution adopting the 2012-2013 biennial operating budget and capital improvements program and declaring the necessity that this resolution become immediately effective.
Thank you very much. Those who know me know that it's not my nature to respond to everything that's in the local newspaper, but the Plain Dealer article on Saturday, November 12th regarding the budget process requires comment. Council is not going on a spending spree. The adjustments that we may propose are unlikely to increase total spending by more than 0.5%. Most of Council's recommendations relate to the most basic of safety net services: mental health, protection of children, homeless services, early childhood health, and determination of eligibility for federal social service programs. Saturday's article gave almost no attention to those requests. There is not an issue over whether reserve funds will be spent. Both the administration and council recognize the need to spend some reserves in the current environment. My colleagues did an excellent job of providing a variety of options, and we did it out in the open. If only the administration had initiatives and the council did not have any initiatives, we would be a sorry lot. We don't have a philosophical disagreement with the administration over the budget. They sent us a very good budget, but it's our job to try to improve upon it. We're likely to improve most or all of the administration's proposals. If we negotiate over a few tenths of a percentage point on the total spend, that's hardly a philosophical disagreement. The new government is making progress because the administration and council are working together. We intend to keep it that way. We've had a good process so far, and together we will pass a budget that provides the right balance between responding to human needs and maintaining sufficient reserves. In terms of process, I would like to call everybody's attention to a document which is in your packet, which is the starting point. This is a set of possible amendments. It's a 4-page document. This document is a shot at trying to merge together the different suggestions that we heard last Wednesday from both the council and the administration. The council has not deliberated about this proposal. The deliberations need to be done out in this open public meeting, which we're going to do. So, but before we get to discussing this proposal, I would like to start with a discussion of the broader picture. And that includes 2 parts. The first part is that I would like to call Director Steen forward and I would like to call Director Steen forward and ask him to provide us some background information on what the prospects would be for the county obtaining a AAA bond rating and what goes into that determination and as much information as you can. Okay, before the director makes his comment, our executive wanted to make a comment. Executive Fitzgerald.
Thank you, and I'll be brief. A couple things. I just want to follow up on a couple things that you mentioned, Councilman, regarding the article in the paper. And again, I usually don't comment on specifics, but I just want to echo some of the things you said, and that I think if there was a broad philosophical disagreement about where the county needed to head financially, I would know about it, and I don't think that there is. Now, it doesn't make any sense for all of the requests of individual legislators to be totaled up as if the body had passed them as a whole, and then express concern about what the total amount is, because no legislative body would ever probably present a balanced budget under those circumstances. And it doesn't make sense for an executive then to, again, it doesn't matter whether it's a mayor, a governor, a president, county executive, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make sense for an executive to react about that. It would be like the president asking all members of Congress what they'd like to spend money on, totaling the entire amount up, and then saying they would veto that if that was passed. Well, that's not the way the process is going to work. And so the way that the process has worked, first of all, is notable, in my opinion, for its transparency, because it isn't typical in a legislative body for members to lay on the table before a budget is passed in written form what they're all talking about doing as their priorities. But this council did, and this council should be complimented for being transparent and open about that. Now, do I have any concerns about any of the requests that were made? Yes. And now, if they were all passed exactly the way they're proposed, would I be able to go along with that? No, of course not. But I don't think that most council members would be willing to do that either. That's the dialogue that we'll be having this week, and I'll be more. You've heard mostly from directors, but I want each and every council member to know that I personally am available to talk to you about any specific requests that you might have. Let me just make a couple comments, though. One is we do have an overarching goal to get to a AAA bond rating. We actually have some reviews that are coming up with one of the rating agencies soon. These are questions that would be asked. It is an important goal for us to set substantively and symbolically, and we're determined to get there. And Wade can talk to you about any of the proposals that we think might be in conflict with that goal. But we will talk to you about that. Secondly, in terms of and again, I'm gonna engage a little bit more specifically with you as this week goes on, but without going through, my personal reactions to any of the requests, I would just say this: that in general, I'm going to have more of an objection to increasing my staffing levels because I don't accept as a truism that the more people that you have doing a function means that you're going to do that function better. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not true. And we want to accept as a challenge that we can, with the thousands of employees that we have, that we can basically do what we need to do. And if that means that we have to move some people around, then we'll do that. If that means that we have to make sure that we're more efficient or we use technology more, then we'll do that. If it means that we have to hold people accountable more, then we'll do that. But I am very leery of defaulting to an increase in staffing because a concern has been expressed in a particular area. Now, there are exceptions to that. And I'll give you an example. I mean, we proposed, probably the biggest increase in staffing that we proposed was actually in the sheriff's office, even though it's only about 10 deputies. But we proposed as part of our public safety initiative that we would have an additional 10 deputies that are going to be assigned. And actually, we've been going through the interview process this week. And you're going to see them in your districts probably by the end of this year or the beginning of the next year. And that's because that was a function entirely that wasn't being done, and it met my requirements. But even before I did that, we talked to the sheriff's office about whether or not we felt like there was enough leeway in the sheriff's personnel, whether or not we could just reassign people. So that, I'm not saying it's an ironclad rule, but I can tell you there have been numerous examples, and I can give you a whole list of them, of when it looked like there was a problem with, let's say, a certain function that we were doing and that it was a function of staffing, but it was really not so much staffing, but it was management. I'll give you a specific example. We have a performance measure that we use with the Department of Children and Family Services for the number of investigations that are completed within 30 days, and then how many are completed within 45 days and so forth. And these are state standards that we're supposed to follow. We had a backlog a significant backlog of thousands of investigations that we're taking, and Pat Rideout may have discussed this with you, but we have cut that down by about 50% just since Pat Rideout got there, without any additional staff. Now, we could have said, well, there's a backlog with investigations, so hire more investigators, you'll get rid of the backlog. We just didn't default to that position. Now, she may complete her, now how did she do it? Well, she made people accountable. They made it a public goal. They said, here's exactly, who has how many cases, let's track it, let's be very public about it, let's accept it. They did some things that might sound a little corny, but they were creative. They had a tree in the office that had leaves, and every time, the leaves represented uninvestigated cases. Every time one was finished, it came down to the bottom. They're trying to create a culture where that was very important. There are counties, by the way, and we were at, I think our original delinquency rate on these was something like 40% that weren't making the state guidelines. There's large counties in Ohio where it's 2%. And we're setting a goal, basically the same thing. We want to be under 5% for investigations that don't get completed on time. Now, she may get to the point where she reduces it to 10%, and she says, I have now done everything I can do, and I can't do anymore, and I need more funding. And at that point, then that would satisfy me, and I might come to the council at that point and say, your management team has done the best that it can. But some of the requests, we haven't reached that conclusion. So those are going to be the ones, and we can have we'll have a discussion about it, and we may disagree about it. But those are the ones when I see them that I would have the most profound philosophical difference was when you're giving me some resources that I'm not asking for yet when it comes to staffing. Some of the other requests having to do with individual social service provider agencies, like the gentleman you just heard from. Those are in a different category. I don't manage those. That's more of an allocation of resource question where we've got to figure out how much of these federal and state cuts do we really want to try to balance in 1 year, and that's another matter. So as the year, I just want to council know I'll be available. I'm going to start attending these meetings more regularly now that we're getting down to the decision point, and I appreciate you, but I just thought it made sense for me, first of all, to defend your process in terms of its transparency, even if I don't agree with every single request, and we'll have a dialogue as the next couple of weeks go on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Director Steen.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I was asked to come talk about the bond rating process and the potential for a AAA bond rating. And I'm going to try to address some questions. I think it was Councilmember Schron had asked about the potential savings we might get from a bond rating increase. I'm going to share with you my thoughts on how we'll go through the bond rating process and what will impact that. And then, as the executive just pointed out, just this morning we received a letter from Fitch, who's going to be doing a reconnaissance call with Director Rubino and I on Wednesday. And I want to share with you some of the questions they've already told us they will ask, because I think you'll find some of those interesting. But first, what could a AAA bond rating mean? If you assume that you can get a 20 to 30 basis point improvement in your debt, and I should back up. Right now the county has $778 million in bonded debt. Not all of that's callable right now. Some of it's taxable with make-whole provisions, and so we can't refinance all that. We can refinance maybe 200 million of that. So 30 basis points is 0.3%. So on 30 basis points, $200 million would yield, $200 million in debt would yield $600,000 a year if we could refinance that. That's $600,000 a year. And then if you think about a go-forward basis, and sometimes that doesn't sound like a big number, but when you multiply that over 10 years, it's $6 million. And when you realize that all the new debt you issue gets issued with the AAA, it starts compounding itself. But I think the question was, what would it mean to us? It might mean $500,000 or more if we could get a AAA bond rating in the next 12 months and get some of our current debt that's callable refinanced. So I wanted to make sure I addressed that question. In terms of the county's bond rating, it's very similar to an individual's credit rating. When a couple, for example, seeks to buy a home, the decision to lend or not is based on numerous factors. What the annual earnings of the couple is, what is the price of the home that they're looking at, how much down payment do they have, what are the home characteristics, how old is the home, What type of home is it? What's the construction? Where is it located? And what's the couple's credit history? A government's no different. When rating agencies look at a government, they base their assessment of each government or entity on the type of government that you have. Is it a municipal government, a county government, a state government? What's its underlying tax structure? What's its history? What are its cash reserves and its reserve policies? What are the local and regional economic factors affecting property values? What's the total base real property value in that area, in this case in Cuyahoga County? What are the employment trends? What are management like? What is management like? And what is leadership like? And management and leadership are here today. That's who I'm speaking with. What is their budget process? And what is their fiscal discipline? I've talked with many of you during this budget process and shared my thoughts. Right now, I feel that the county really needs stability and patience as we look at a AAA bond rating. The executive has put forth a very lean, controlled budget that addresses the needs of the county while trying to maintain reserves as much as possible. We're in a very fragile economic state in Cuyahoga County. There is still much uncertainty. There could be additional state budget cuts. The sexennial reappraisal is upcoming. The economy. There are current capital improvements underway in Cuyahoga County, and the hope is that they all come in on time and produce the results that we hope for. Sound, stable financial management guides organizations through unpredictable times. When the rating agencies assess us, they may be skeptical of new or large additional spending at a time like this. I am not sure how we communicate the real need to utilize some reserves, but we're going to have to work together when we are utilizing those reserves. What they will see is a brand new government, and so you've got a clean slate, but this is going to be what they know about Cuyahoga County going forward. Our tax structure is uncertain because the state could cut us again. But we do know what our underlying tax structure is, and that is we're primarily funded by property tax, and we believe that property values may go down. History, there's no easy way to put it. Our history in this county is not the best. But as I just said, this is a new government, so maybe we can move forward and start a new chapter. Our reserves, that's our strength. Economic factors, capital improvements are being undertaken, more than $5 billion if you total it all up. Again, that is a strength. Management and fiscal discipline, that really comes down to council and the executive. As your fiscal officer, I believe the appropriate course at this time is to try to hold up or delay any major budget modifications or initiatives. You have a 24-month plan in front of you, and if we wait 3 to 6 months to see if we're on track, we may be better served in the long run. The questions that Fitch is going to put forward to us on Wednesday when we have our call are interesting. One of the questions is, please give us the status of the FBI investigation. Please discuss construction progress on Medical Mart. Is it on time, on budget? When is the expected opening? Committed tenants. Please discuss the status of the Horseshoe Casino. Is it projected to open in March of 2012? What is the projected economic impact? I'm just grabbing some of the questions. Please discuss any major economic developments in the county and Ed Fitzgerald's Fourth Frontier program. Please discuss the impact of state funding cutbacks on the county's finances. How much in state funds did the county lose in 2010 and 11, and what are you projecting to lose in 2012 and going forward? Please discuss year-to-date fiscal year 2011 revenues, including property and sales tax revenues, and expenditures compared to budget for fiscal year 2011. What is the estimate for general fund balance for the general fund balance and unreserved balance as of December 31st, 2011? She notes here, and I say she, it's a female that will be conducting the call, Karen Wagner. I have the executive's recommended budget for 2012-13, revised October 31. I've read the budget. Has the 2012-13 budget been adopted yet? If not, when is the drop dead date? She's going to have a lot of questions. I'm told they also watch these online now that we're up. Discuss any sources of financial flexibility available to the county in terms of general revenues, revenues that could be raised or increased, and expenditures that could be contained or further cut. Then she cites a news article. On October 31st, 2011, Article 5 on your side referenced a list of dirty dozen of delinquent property taxpayers mentioned and that there were more than $400 million owed to the county in back taxes. What is the county doing to try to collect back taxes and prevent further abuse? I'm glad they're asking that question because I think the tax certificate sale that was approved by this council plays well to answering that question on one of the things that we're going to do. They have 23 detailed questions. I've read just a few, but those are the kind of questions that one rating agency will be asking us this week. I hope I've addressed the question concerning the bond rating and what I see as your fiscal officer, and Mr. Chairman would be happy to answer any questions any of the members have.
Okay, before I open it up to questions, I would like to bring to everybody's attention one other document which is in your packet. It is a one-page document entitled Reserve Fund Analysis. And what this document does is that it summarizes the projected reserves that we would maintain under the budget that's introduced, and also under the set of possible amendments which serve as the starting point, which includes an additional health and human services spend of about $3.6 million a year, including the $800 million a year proposed by the administration for universal pre-K. And it includes about an increase of an average of $1.6 million in the general fund. And as you see, as for the general fund, the balance to the expenditure, these numbers are right out of the budget book. It's currently 33.1%. It's 31.3% in 2012 and 30.8% in 2013. And under the starting point package, it's a little bit lower, but still well above the 25% benchmark at 30.2% and 29.8%. In terms of the Health and Human Services levy, it's the same under both proposals because the drawdown would come from the Public Assistance Fund as opposed to the levy balance itself. So those are the numbers right out of the budget book at 20.3, 19.4, and 20.4. The next section discusses the Public Assistance Fund. And unlike the other funds, the Public Assistance Fund is not a fund that has its own source of revenue. It only has money in it when money is transferred from the levy fund or other sources in order to pay for specific programs. And so for that fund, it doesn't make sense to speak of a balance to expenditure. However, the chart does show what the projected balance in that fund would be under the two scenarios. And as you can see, there is a higher draw on the Public Assistance Fund under the starting point proposal as opposed to as introduced. Finally, we come to an analysis which I actually find to be the most useful in terms of looking at the reserves in the human service area. And that is to add up the balance in the Health and Human Services levy and the balance in the Public Assistance Fund, and then run that as a balance to expenditure on the human services spending. And in that analysis, you have 41.2%, 37.8%, and 33.9% as introduced, and under the package of amendments, the balances are somewhat lower at 35.7, 30, and 30.1, but still substantial. So I provide that information just as further matter for discussion, and at this point, I would ask for any questions, and starting with Councilman Brady.
Mr. Chairman, my question is, although we'll have one, is not to Mr. Steen at this point. It's to the chairman about the document that you've presented. Obviously, the document that, the part of the document that is, the bill is introduced, the proposal is introduced by the executive is clear. When you say starting point, whose starting point is this?
Okay, when I say starting point, what I'm referring to is the 4-page document that's in your package.
So I thought that might be the case. I just wanted to be sure. So
Right.
this is the chairman's recommended starting point.
This is the chairman's recommended starting point. Since under the new way of doing things, we could not go out over the weekend and get together as a group and hash it out and come up with something.
I understand.
We couldn't do
Asking.
that, and so I thought that it would be helpful if I were to take the recommendations that came from both the administration and the council and come up with something that seemed to include the things that were most strongly pushed for and where we had information, and so you have a document which can serve hopefully as a starting point for discussion and nothing more.
First of all, I do appreciate the work that you've done, and I think that it is helpful for you to provide a starting point. I just wanted to be sure what I'm looking at.
That's right. That's what
Okay.
you're looking at.
Thank you.
Okay. Questions by my colleagues? Yes, Councilman Germano.
Mr. Chairman, my question to Mr. Steen is concerning the Health and Human Service levy balances. Does that go into the consideration of the health and of the AAA bond rating?
To the council member through the chair, it does, but not to the same extent as the general fund, because you can't move HHS dollars over to cover general fund shortages. But if you have a health and human service fund that starts to look like it's getting depleted, the assumption would be that you would move general fund dollars there. So it is something that they would look at, but it would not carry as much weight as the reserve balance in the general fund. That's the one they look primarily at.
Mr. Chairman, the second part of this is the level, whether it's whatever's on this page, 42 down to 30. I thought the previous government had a target of keeping 15 to 20% level of reserve. Is there a need for us to be keeping this high a reserve in the Health and Human Services levy?
To the council member through the chair, the reserve level is actually 25%. And as I mentioned in my comments, this is our strength. What the chairman has put in front of you are reserve balances. This is the strength of the county, that we have these reserve balances. 25% is a very, very solid balance. I know that one of the council members has proposed talking about reserve policies. I would strongly encourage that also, so that you know when you're using your reserves and how you replenish those reserves, because I think that all plays into this image of fiscal discipline and what I would call strong financial management. But direct answer to your question, these are good, solid reserve balances, and the percentages are above the 25%.
Mr. Chairman, if the goal is to definitely keep the reserve at 25%, whether it's the general fund or the Health and Human Services, it seems to me that we have room to spend and authorize Health and Human Service needs, because we're much above that 25%. That, and when I talked about my budget desires, and I didn't want to spend anything until I knew that we're not jeopardizing the county's bond rating in any way. But people pass this Health and Human Service levy to help people because we've got people hurting. And so, my feeling is I'd like to do what the people want, and that is to give services where people in need it. But I want to keep a responsible reserve. So that's the only reason why I'm questioning it, because I won't vote for spending any more money if it in any way could hurt the county. But I think the Health and Human Service levy balances are different than the general fund.
Any, Councilman Greenspan?
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, I like the presentation as far as at least giving us a path to identifying what the bonding agencies are going to look at, which is one of the items. If we remember last week when I spoke, I said, we as a body need to understand, figure out, I used the terminology, where do we want to be, when we grow up, and I use that facetiously, meaning, this is a new body, what are we looking to do? Obviously, the first proposal that I suggest was understanding what the AAA bond rating would mean, which was explained, and the path for us to get there. So I appreciate those comments, and actually, there was a comment that the director mentioned insofar as us being able to effectively not do any additional spending for 3 to 6 months into next year, which was similar to my comment I was going to make today. Not that the identification of potential items might not be necessary, but as far as making the actual decision to pull the trigger on any additional spending, to hold off until we have an ability to have somewhat of a look-back period to make sure that our our property tax revenues and our sales tax income meet the objectives in the budget, as well as our ability to control our expenditures as outlined in the budget. I think that would be fiscally prudent. Now, some of the items that I talked on last week, and I've done an analysis, and I apologize for not having it in a paper format, but that's why I've got my laptop here. We sought some input from Matt Rubino, so I'm clear on some of the reserves on balanced uses of funds and what's going to be needed going forward and what's not. But before we even identify that, we have to understand two fundamental programs that the county is contemplating undertaking within the budget. Number one, the $100 million Economic Development Fund. I know that there's $8 million reserved in the 2011 budget for future years, but what is it that we plan on doing with that fund going forward? For example, I understand that $8 million is enough to seed the program, and then the loan repayment, the interest, be able to satisfy the obligation and keep it going. But there's been some discussion about loan forgiveness or grants included. There's also, and I'm not sure that we've contemplated any bad debt exposure with the fund. And so if we were to look at what possible utilization of reserve balances may be needed to satisfy some of those items, we need to contemplate that. The other initiative that is in the budget that by charter mandate we have to put forward is a scholarship program. And although there's $6 million in the other strategic initiatives category in the 2011 budget, what is it that we want to do? And I know that Joanne Gross is putting together a compilation of a number of scenarios and recommendations from council on what that program is to look like. But we yet have to define that. There's some discussion of setting aside the equivalent of an endowment and allow the interest once the endowment is funded to be the future catalyst for funding the scholarship. Well, if that's a policy that this body is going to undertake, we need to know that to include it in the budget. And then obviously, if we do, and conservatively, as an example, reserve 2% in the Economic Development Fund for either bad debt or debt forgiveness or grants or what have you on an ongoing basis, and set a strategic initiative in place to create this quote-unquote endowment, we will, at the end of 2013, need to, we will fall below the 25% in the general fund alone. So those are just some concepts. My point of bringing it up is we have yet to define those, and yet we're putting together a budget that I think we at least need to have further discussion to understand exactly the ramifications of some of our decisions.
Okay.
Councilman.
Councilman Schwan, Jones, and Brady.
Just as a quick comment on the $100 million fund, there will be a discussion later in this joint session where we are going to be talking about that, and it seems to me it behooves this council to listen to where the ramifications are of that. Ultimately, when it's successful, we will then be generating more revenue as a result of the successful $100 million fund, which will show up, but that won't show up until probably years 2, 3, or 4 down the road. It will not show up in year 1. You will not see that, I believe, and we'll hear some of that, I believe, later between yourself and Mr. Rubino. In your forecast for the overall economy itself, because everything is going to be derivative of that and the tax base, where are you forecasting for the next 3 to 5 years as far as what you're going to see in both the high and the low?
To the councilman through the chair, you're talking in terms of just general growth, GDP growth?
Right, which is going to then affect, obviously, the tax base, which affects our sales tax and all those revenue increases.
I would say in the short term, you're saying 1 to 2% growth. I'm hoping that we can get to 3% growth maybe 3 years out and then start to come back up. I see the biggest risk right now is still in this short term, next year to 2 years, because I don't see the growth coming at what I would call an accelerated rate of 3 or 4%. I see it more at a 1.5% growth rate. And we're a little different than, when you talk about GDP across the country, because we're still facing some challenges in Cuyahoga County that other parts of the country don't have to face.
Pretty minuscule forecasting as far as the growth that you're seeing with that 1 to 1.5, 2%.
Yeah.
Barely keeping up with even with inflation.
To the councilman through the chair, yes. If anything, I'm sure the council members have all figured out by now, I'm very conservative. I think that's what you would want me to be. And so it may be better than that, but I'd rather bet on 1.5 or 2 and have it come in above that than project out a 3 for you and then have you.
On your conference call with the rating agency, will they see it more positively or less positively if we start tapping into the reserve balance in this first year of the county budget, in your belief?
To the councilman through the chair, I think it depends on the amount and what you tap into it for. I don't think tapping into the reserve is necessarily a bad thing. I think one of the questions they might have is, we watched the video of Monday's Finance Committee meeting and they were proposing using X dollars for this. Can you explain that? So I think that the direct answer to the councilman is how much, what's a reasonable amount, and what are you using it for will be the real important questions that they're going to ask.
Will increasing the spending above the county executive's budget level increase or decrease, in your opinion, the likelihood for bond rating improvement?
I think if it's increased above the county executive's proposal by a very modest amount, we would be okay. I think if it's a larger amount, it's going to cause some questions. They're watching right now. They're trying to, my guess is they're trying to get a feel for what kind of council this is, because they're making an assessment based upon your process now, which has been a very good process, but we're going to be visiting with them ongoing. And if this is a council that they get the feeling, and I'm not saying this is a council that does that, that taps reserves and spends above projections consistently, it makes it real hard 4 and 5 years from now to ever bring that back. And so I think you really want to consider what kind of image do you want to provide to them, and what kind of discipline and leadership do you want to show in this first round of this new government, which is the 11 of you sitting here.
And the last question, in regards to the bond rating, the 30 basis points that you anticipate on the low side, maybe potentially 35, 40 basis points as far as the differential by getting the AAA bond rating. That differential is also reflective of where our currently low interest rates are in relationship, is it not?
To the councilman through the chair, yeah, and it's probably closer to 20 basis points right now. The market conditions are just, they're not good for us to go out and refinance right now, but yeah, that's given the low market conditions.
So you're not forecasting, I wish you were, but I can't believe you're forecasting these low interest rates for the next 10 years that you're looking at as far as debt financing potentially.
To the councilman through the chair, I hope not. If they're this low 10 years from now, we've all got a lot of problems.
Which means the bond rating differential will increase as the rates start to increase.
To the councilman through the chair, absolutely. Getting a AAA bond rating early is going to pay great dividends 5 and 10 years from now when the rates go up.
More than just the amount that you've already identified.
I understand your question, councilman, through the chair. Yes, absolutely. It multiplies as the rates go up.
Councilman Jones and then Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Jones, Brady, Simon. Yes, okay. Okay.
I want to start really by making a comment based on my own experience, and to give myself and share with you the visual architecture I use to see this process. I compare what we're doing at the county to what we do at the church I attend. In church, we collect funds, your offering, and as you come to the front of the church, there are two baskets. There's one that has the general fund, and then there's one called the benevolent fund. In the general fund, you pay the church's gas bill, the light bill, the preacher's salary, the staff's salary, any debt the church might have, and those are what the general fund dollars go to. Benevolent fund goes towards benevolent work. Church member that can't meet their gas bill this month, or their light bill, or their mortgage, or any good work. That's what those dollars go towards. Well, as a member and having business experience and background, I went to the church business meeting and looked at the financials, and I saw they had plenty of money in the payroll account. They had spent less money than they were taking in. But they had a low amount in that benevolent fund. And I went to the chairman of the deacon board and said, I can give you some ideas on how we can raise that money, raise the levels, and keep that money up. And he said, well, that's not really the focus. He actually said it would be an indictment on the church if they kept high reserves of benevolent fund dollars when there was so much need coming in from the church, from the membership of the church on a regular basis. He said our gas bills are paid, our lights are paid. You know, we can borrow money. We're fiscally responsible. When we need to add on to the church, we're able to borrow. So it changed my mindset from my business experience to add to that experience the importance of having, of recognizing the process they use to meet the need out in the community. So that's my experience and what I see here. And as we talk about the reserve funds, and the plain dealer did, you know, don't always comment on what they have to say, but when it comes to us spending, I want to be fiscally responsible. But I see a division, as our chairman has laid out in this reserve fund analysis. There are three funds. Our general fund, which is no different than at the church. But the other two funds are the benevolent fund, the human services, and the public assistance fund. Those are the dollars that the people have asked us to, through the levy, to meet their needs in the community. This is a reformed government, and we know what happened just a few summers ago through Children and Family Services. The tear in the safety nut because the cuts were too deep in one department. Okay? So we have an obligation to make sure that we are maintaining and strengthening that safety net, making sure that there are no tears in that net, and other very important things, whether they be dollars towards helping people to move to self-sufficiency, to the Rosary Hall we just heard about, putting people in the position to just be able to get a job. Human services has to be an economic development engine. I see that as the new mandate from our county charter, and that preamble that tells us the people want a government that is more, that significantly improves their economic competitiveness. And that's one area, job creation. And human services has the capacity to do that. And if we have the dollars, I think we need to be prudent with them, but use them in a way that accomplishes the goals and the mandates of our county charter. So having said that, my one question to you on the fiscal side, the AAA bond rating, can we internally get a AAA bond rating? Or are there factors, as you mentioned before, local and regional economic factors that impact or maybe even prevent us from self-determining that we get a AAA bond rating?
To the council member through the chair, I do believe the county can get a AAA bond rating. It's not as easy here as, say, Franklin County, where they don't have the same challenges, but I think it's achievable because there are some positive things. There's a great story to tell in terms of all the capital improvements that are going on, the billions of dollars in new construction that's going on in the county. The new government is a great story to tell. As Director Rubino has shared a couple of times, sales tax are starting to inch up. That's a good sign. I would really like to see unemployment start to tick down. And as those things happen, I think we have that chance. But it's not tomorrow, but hopefully in the next 12 months, we are going to continue to do reconnaissance with the rating agencies on the phone. I think the executive has shared, we had some of them in town in September, showed them around, and I think one of the things about the AAA bond rating is you've got to continue to tell your story. My understanding was it's almost like courting a little bit. And the prior administrations never took the time to reach out to the rating agencies and tell them all the good things that were happening. And there are good things happening. So I think the direct answer, Councilman, is yes, we can get there. It's achievable. It's not going to be easy, so to speak, but it's achievable, and I think we'll do it.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman.
the dollars that we are looking to distribute now, are they coming from the general fund or from the other two level funds? And if any are coming from the general, what percentage?
To the councilman through the chair, are you speaking of the 4 pages here? Or I'm not sure what dollars you mean.
I'm discussing our entire discussion and the dollars that may be added to the executive's recommended budget. Will those dollars come strictly from the Health and Human Service and the Public Assistance Fund? Do any of them dip into the general reserve? And if so, to what degree do they dip into the general reserve?
To the council member through the chair, I think they utilize both reserves. I don't know the exact amounts, but I think there were requests coming out of the general fund and requests coming out of the Health and Human Service Levy Fund reserves. There were requests coming from both.
Okay, thank you.
To Councilman Jones, the director is correct, but the amounts from the general fund are much less than the amounts proposed from the Human Services. Executive Fitzgerald.
Just briefly, and this is just in response to what actually Councilman Germana kind of made the same point, but also what Councilman Jones just said. In terms of looking at just the reserve fund on the human services side of it, there's also an appropriate amount of reserve to be kept, having nothing to do with whether or not it affects the bond rating in any event, because you have to have a certain amount of contingency that is considered to be prudent in case there are things that you don't anticipate, like a levy failing, or all of a sudden something happens where the state cuts additional funds that we didn't anticipate, which is certainly possible. There could be a change in federal administration where all of a sudden you have significantly less federal support, which we've already had before. So a portion of it isn't just whether or not those funds were voted by the people for a good purpose. They were, and it doesn't make sense to hold them according to some artificial formula, because we want to use them for needed services and good and services that we think can help people in the community. But we just have to make sure that besides the effect that it may or may not have on a bond rating, because as Mr. Steen says, it has an effect on the bond rating, it doesn't have as direct effect. But what a bond rating agency is going to look at is whether or not a legislative body or a government is funding their spending habits by tapping into reserves, because what you end up creating is a long-term trend line that isn't sustainable. That's what the problem is. It's different if somebody was making a request for a single year expenditure and wanted to tap into a portion of the HHS reserve just for a specific project that is only going to be 1 year in duration. But you can bet that if you fund it this year, then that's going to become the expectation that that's what happens. So it's your point is well taken, but there's that other factor that I think is involved there. I would also say, just also in terms of what determines a bond rating, because my city went through it and we had our bond rating increased. They do look at external factors like how much economic development is going on. We're actually lucky that we have a good story to tell, because there are counties, and Franklin County is an example, they have a higher bond rating than we do, but we have a lot more economic development projects that are on the drawing board and should be launched in the next few years than they do. Now, we have our poverty rates higher. There's some other things that we have to deal with, but actually our poverty isn't that much higher, because theirs has actually become, they have more, their poverty rate has grown in the last few years. So those numbers are starting to equal out. So this is one portion of it, but we think we'll have a nice balanced story to tell between what we're doing in the public sector and what's happening in the private sector.
Councilman Brady, followed by Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I realize you're receiving the benefit of our thoughts because you happen to be standing at the podium. Let me try to I'll try anyway to steer back to the AAA bonding goal that we have. You mentioned several things that you would probably be asked about, a wide variety of things. Some seem difficult to answer. How does, how do they look at the fact that the county raised taxes to build the convention center, just in terms of the level of taxation in the county? You mentioned the medical mart. Do they see that as a plus or a minus? I mean, what strikes me as, interestingly enough, is that we've got this very exciting project going on, but we never asked the voters whether or not they wanted to fund it. But we're all very excited about it, and we know it has to be successful, because you can imagine how unhappy people will be if they have paid taxes that they were not asked for permission for and paid for an unsuccessful project. On the other hand, we have health and human service levies where people have asked and said yes to spend money for these purposes. And we're trying to decide how much of that money they've given us permission to spend prudently. And so the question is, does the increase in the sales tax for the convention center, is that a plus or a minus in terms of the bond rating?
To the councilman through the chair, Councilman, I think it's a little bit of both. The nature of their questions were, is the project coming in on time, and what's it going to do? I think it's a positive right now. I mean, one of the things that I'm going to share with them, and I think Jeff Applebaum shared with council not too long ago, is the amount of contingency that's not being used and put back. That's a good thing to tell them. What we don't want to tell them is a project starts to run over budget. If the medical mart was running over budget and we had increased taxes, that's not a good story. If it's coming in on time and you're returning contingency, I think they view it as a positive, because I think they view it as there's going to be economic activity generated from this. So I think in the long run, it's a positive if we can bring it in on budget on time.
Very good. One more follow-up question, Mr. Chairman, at this time. The amount of the percentage of reserves that has kind of been kicked around a lot, and there's nothing wrong with having more reserves than the amount that's been kicked around a lot. But we've kicked around the 25% mark is a good marker. We're generally talking about the general fund here, but we also sort of talk about that in terms of the Health and Human Service Fund as well. Of course, there are two funds here. The Health and Human Service Fund, two funds, not one, but two. And I guess the question is, would they be looking at both Health and Human Service funds and reserves in both of those funds, or not? You said that they would be looking at it less in the first place. And is there, if we were to have, does it help us achieve this goal of a AAA bond rating? How much are we helped by having a 30% reserve in the general fund than a 25% general fund, from which I'm for, but from everything I know, which is limited around the state, it's a high reserve fund. It's a good, healthy, high reserve fund. And no one, I don't believe anybody, has even considered going below that. So how much more do we gain by staying above it? Not meaning that we need to spend money if it's there, but just as trying to understand the relationship that it and our goal that we're here to talk about right now, the bond rating.
To the councilman through the chair, an excellent question. I don't know if I can quantify the difference between having 30% and 25. As I'd mentioned when the chair distributed the reserve analysis, this is our strength, and we're well above 25%, which is a positive. But I don't know if being at 30% covers up other, what I would call shortcomings in your presentation. One of the things that is, we're going to be, the make or break for Cuyahoga County is going to be in March when they vote on the HHS levy. Guys, that's the make or break. If the voters, for some reason, were to reject the levy, then all of a sudden the reserve and the levy fund is pretty well going to be gone, and you're going to need general fund. So I think the voters need to support that levy. which tells the rating agencies and tells the world, we support these services, you've got good reserves, you've got capital improvements, that's when we're ready to go tell this story. But the direct answer to your question, I don't know if having 30% buys me that much extra versus 25. I wish I could quantify it, I can't. But being above 25 is important. We're in great shape there. And the other thing, and this might be obvious, but when you think about your rating presentation is your leadership, and I have a guess that Executive Fitzgerald and President Conley and I will do a little bit better job when we go talk about the county than the former auditor and the former commissioner. Those are your salespeople. So if you think about it, the rating agency, that's who they were meeting with. The former auditor. The guy who held this job was the guy who went in and was trying to sell people on Cuyahoga County. I guess that didn't come out right, sell people on Cuyahoga County. But we're going to go in with a much different story on all the positives that are going on here. And so I've confidence in the council president and the executive in doing the job of making people understand how good things are here.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
Councilman Brady didn't ask me, but I want to answer it too, because just two things. One is I've asked these exact same questions. What do we get at 30% that we don't get at 25%? But the question, I think especially in the short term, because we're kind of establishing some patterns and we're making presentations to a bond rating agency that we've never made before, and I think it's important to probably compensate for some of the negative things in our portfolio or in our past in a way. But it's not so much whether we're at 30% or 31% this year. It's whether or not, this is my opinion of having dealt with rating agencies for a few years. I mean, Wade has more experience, but that they're looking at what your trajectory is. And if you look like you're spending in an unstructurally balanced way, they may say, well, you're only getting down to 29%, but you were at 32%, now you're 29%, and if you keep doing this as you project it out, that's what I'm more concerned about. If we knew we were going to be able to lock in for the next 10 years at a certain percentage, I think that will be helpful. And rating agencies like to see that long-term decisions have been made, not one-year decisions based on advocacy, as compelling as the advocacy may be. And I just think at this point in time, that's what we have to, and that's not an answer to your question. That's my concern. That's the exact same question I've had with them. Now, to your first point that you made, and this isn't to make a political point, but in terms of what do they like to see in terms of that taxes went up? I'll tell you what, Wade, you can correct me if I'm wrong, although you might want to wait till the cameras aren't on you. But they want to see that a government agency is willing to fund what it wants to do. If they hear and it's kind of a strange combination of what's considered to be fiscally conservative and what isn't. If they like it when they see that we're reducing expenditures, that we're being more economical, that we have long-term plans to reduce our personnel expenses, that we're getting concessions from labor unions. They like to see that. They don't like to hear people saying, I won't raise taxes under any circumstances. Because the message they get from that is that you're inflexible. As a matter of fact, one of the tactics that cities have used has been, they don't say it publicly all the time, but they go into the bond rating agency and saying, we're going to raise taxes. And sometimes the bond rating agency likes to hear that. And they don't always like to hear that they're going to necessarily put it on the ballot, because that entails a certain amount of risk. They don't know what the voters are going to do. So it didn't necessarily hurt us, I don't think, that the previous commissioners were willing to raise taxes and do it without a vote of the people, because it shows that the county government is willing to put its money where its mouth is. Now, that is one of the reasons, not the sole reason, but it's one of the reasons that my predilection is not to raise taxes, but I never say that I would never raise taxes. If all the numbers went in the wrong direction and we weren't able to fund the human services or other projects that we felt were actually absolutely essential, I don't say that I wouldn't consider a tax increase. And they want to know, A, that your elected leadership has the guts to do that, if it comes to that, not that it's going to be their first priority, and B, that the taxation system as a whole has enough room in it. So like on a city side, if you're already at 3% on your income tax, you're running up against what the ceiling would be of what your constituents would accept. If you're at 1 and 1.5%, you have room to go. So that'll be a question that they'll get into, is how much have we already taxed ourselves up until this point?
Mr. Chairman, just because I think it's like the Republican debates, you're allowed to respond if you've been singled out.
Right. There were three departments I was going to eliminate, but I can't.
I don't know that you've been singled out, but please proceed.
I hope you know I'm kidding. But thank you anyway. I guess, that you make some good points. What I would be a little concerned about is if we set an expectation that our reserve rate is going to be, much higher than maybe what it even should be. And then we're always, in the position of, well, you're not saving as much money as you did last year. Maybe we shouldn't set the expectation quite as high. We're going to get stuck in a position where we're always expected to have a 30% reserve, and is that an issue? And do the things we get out of having a AAA bonding, are they significant enough to override constantly having a higher reserve than we need, and therefore not being able to deliver services potentially in the county to the level we would like to, and to the level that we can afford to?
Those are all the questions you should be asking. But I would just say this one final thing about it, is that the reserve is only funded once. Once it's there, it's there. It's just whether you dip into it or not. So once you have your 30% reserve or 27% or 20, whatever the level is, it's not like every year you're reallocating additional money to make up, to go from 25 to 30%. It's a set amount that's there. So it's like it's a savings account that's there, and you decide whether you're going to dip into it. It doesn't mean if you keep that same amount in the savings account that the next year, kind of when you do your household budget, now you've got to fund it all over again at a 30% rate. It's just whether or not you tap into it. So I'm just saying that it's not, it is worth X millions of dollars, and that those millions of dollars are static in a way, depending on how the budget might grow. But really, in terms of the bigger picture, of terms of what long-term, what social programs do we fund at what level, that debate, it's kind of a one-time debate. Are you going to get into that excess between 25 and 30%, or are you not? That's all I'd say about it.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Simon.
Thank you. Just a few comments regarding the bond issue. Obviously, we want to maintain a reserve to get hopefully a better rating. But at the same time, we're here in a perfect storm with this, we have a fiscal crisis that the people in our county are desperately going to be hit by this. And I know we all know this is the balance, but I think these are extraordinary times. And it's extraordinary because we have a new government. We have an opportunity to sell ourselves and rebrand ourselves and come in with a solid plan for 2 years. But at the same time, I'm not willing to say the people, our residents, the people who are in need of services are going to take the hit because of that. So I just want to say that it's just a conflagration of losing funds from every angle, and people are really suffering. And even with regard to the incarceration, with the policy at the state level to reduce the number of individuals incarcerated will then require further services on the outside. And I just think from every angle we're being hit. So when we look at this budget, I definitely want to have a reserve, but at the same time, this trend, I think that's an artificial place to put us in, because this is a starting point. I'm going to use our Councilman Miller's. What is our starting point? The trend, I think, from now is the beginning. We're setting it right now. It's not that we're going to be looking at going up or down. It's solidifying at this point in time. So this is how we're defining ourselves at this very extraordinary time. And the only second point I want to make is because we have this 2-year budget, I'm anticipating we're going to be coming back in 2 years. So I don't think we need to define what our scholarship program is today. I don't think we have to set in stone exactly every single program that we're going to be contemplating in this budget. It's impossible, and it would be irresponsible to some extent to sit here and try to expedite things just so we can look at our budget. It's going to be a relationship that we're going to be looking at for 2 years and expect to come back, especially we're waiting for the analysis from our property reevaluation to see where we are. Those are my only comments.
Councilman Germana, followed by Greenspan and Schwan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I still go back to what I was trying to say at the beginning, and I think from the way I'm looking at this, the operating general fund is a lot different than the Health and Human Service. And it says here in the budget book that the target for a Health and Human Service has been 15%. And since Mr. Jones brought up church, you know, yesterday in church I heard, and I'll just paraphrase what I heard yesterday, and was talking about the master giving some reserves to different servants, and the one servant took his portion and buried it. And, you know, at the end, you know, the master threw him out, and the gnashing of teeth and everything else because he didn't use the funds wisely. And it kind of struck me. I'm thinking, hey, is this a message about the Health and Human Service levy? So, in respect to what you said about, we definitely want to pass and do everything we can to get this Health and Human Service levy renewed. And maybe we could wait for the additional funding on this Health and Human Service to March. That is not that far off. But I don't want to bury resources that people wanted for the people that needed it in this county, because we've heard time and time again that treatment works. So I'm just looking at, you know, the projection of a reserve of 43 million, and based on the projected revenues in 12 and 13, the 15% level would be somewhere around 33, 34 million. So, so I just wanted to be clear. I'm not talking about overspending on the operating to general fund, but I think there should be some movement on the Health and Human Service reserves. But I'm, as a council person, am willing to wait a few months, and certainly, if the levy passes, then there is the possibility that we could free up some of those funds, and that's just the point I was trying to make, Mr. Chairman.
Councilman Greenspan.
Great, thank you. Councilwoman Simon brought up a good point insofar as the perspective of a budget. A budget is nothing more than a financial measurement to an operational plan. And I think we need to keep that in mind, because the choices of how we utilize county resources, regardless of the fund, is our operational plan. There is a stated policy, as Councilman Germana mentioned, in the budget regarding the reserve balance at 25% and the HHS at 15%. I believe now, dovetailing in the conversation or the discussion that Mr. Steen brought forward, was that the things that the funding agencies want to see is that we have a firm stated policy. We currently have an objective, but no firm policy. I've brought forward three series of ordinances on three separate topics. The amounts in there are obviously subject to debate by the Finance Committee, I'm sure, when it gets presented to council, would be to do just that, establish what the reserve balance limits are. Number two, the second is, if we utilize the reserves, which we will have to from time to time, either revenue will not meet our expectations in the short term, an event will happen that will cause us to utilize those funds. There are a series of opportunities that we will have to utilize those resources. But, and I believe I heard Mr. Steen say, what is your protocol? What is the county's protocol for replenishing those funds? Should we utilize those? That's one of the other ordinances that I brought forward, so that we're able to demonstrate that, hey, we've set a policy. If we have to utilize the funds from time to time, here's how we'll replenish it. And the final ordinance basically says, if we have discretionary funds, if at the end of the day, our fund balance reserves are met, our budget is in balance, and we have excess funding, how is it that we utilize those funds? I think those three items address the bonding issue, but also for the county. It assesses and provides a protocol that the residents of this county, the financial institutions, and the administration understand what we want and what we want to be perceived to be as a fiscally responsible entity, but at the same time being conscious of the fact that there are needs within our community need to be addressed. And I believe if we're able to provide that balance with whatever the limits are, if they're the existing limits of 25 and 15, there's a program in place to replenish, and there's a program in place to define how funds are used. That satisfies a lot of needs from this body, the executive, and from the administration and the external users of our county. So I'll be bringing those forward, but it's important, I think, when we talk about developing a new form of government, because we're not just talking about what we are today or what we are in all of our first terms. What are we going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when we're not involved in government anymore? We need to develop the legacy today, and I believe these discussions are helpful in identifying that, and we're upfront by knowing the objective is AAA bond rating. Mr. Steen said, here's exactly what we need to do. We've got tools in place to make that happen, and I believe we are setting the tone to create and craft a legacy that will far exceed our terms on this body. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Schran, followed by Rogers and Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with Councilwoman Simon that this is a starting place, and to me it seems as though as good as any starting place is what you folks in the budget office have done for us and worked up, and the county executive has approved, because we heard clearly from one of the committees that came before us, or one of the bodies that came before us, that even though with those numbers, one of them asked for $25 million more than what you had in there. So it doesn't matter what the number is. Somebody can always ask for more and have a rationale in their mindset. And when I look at the starting place, your starting place, Mr. Chairman, is $750,000 for that same request of $25 million. Is the $25 million correct? The $750,000, or what the county executive has already proposed? I suggest that we've already had a starting place. I think it was done in good faith and good planning. Question for you, Mr. Steen, is the passage of rules and a policy whereby we would try to live within those rules with adjustments up or down should an emergency take place, beneficial as to how we state that reserve policy as opposed to the ad hoc method we have right now?
To the council member, through the chair, the policy I'm familiar with from the city where I was a council member and we were AAA bond rated is when we would tap into our reserves, it required a vote greater than just a simple majority. Because what I think someone outside wanted to see is, does a majority of the body, whatever the body is, believe that you should be tapping into the reserves? And so that would require more than just a simple majority. The other piece of our policy was, it was a municipal government, so city administration had to put forth, along with that request to use reserves, what's the payback period going to be and how are you going to do that? We wanted to give them some flexibility, because to assume payback within 12 months might not be reasonable. If you hit a catastrophe and you say, we have to use the money now, this is a problem, it might take 3 years to replace that. The council, in this case, this body would say, okay, X amount of time to replenish the reserve is appropriate, and 7 or 8 of us feel that this is the right time to tap into the reserves. It's those kind of general policies that I think an outsider would want to see, because it's well thought and it shows the support of a broad cross-section of the council. More than simple majority and a reasonable way to get the funds replenished.
Then to summarize, you had actual rules that had to be, that were passed by your body, and those rules were what you had to adhere to if you wanted to increase or tap into the reserves in some form.
To the councilman, through the chair, yeah, we had accounting. We had use of fund reserves.
Okay, specifically stated, passed by the body and put in place. Yes. Okay. And then just as a follow-up on the last, the purpose of the reserves is for unknown contingencies. And I think one of the ones that you alluded to was what if, in March, the what if is, will it pass, the Health and Human Services levy, will it not pass? We've all been around elections long enough to know that sometimes they pass and sometimes things don't go successfully. I would agree with Mr. Germano that we ought to at least be waiting till after that time before we spend any more beyond the stated beginning place that the county executive has put us.
Councilman Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question regarding when and how often the rating agencies review a request for change in our status, and when could we expect to have a determination made on whether or not we've made AAA?
To the councilman through the chair, we actually make that request. You actually have to pay them to get re-rated, but they do what's called reconnaissance on an ongoing basis because our debt is held by many. And so between Fitch, Moody's, and Standard & Poor's, they're constantly looking at us. I bet they do at least 2 looks a year. They read the newspaper articles, they look at the budget, they read the audited financial statements. They have analysts that pay attention to all of their entities. But the next time, direct answer to the council member, the next time we would get rated is when this body, along with the executive, says we want to go out for a rating, we pay the rating agencies, and we put together the presentation. And that'll be when we have everything in place, all of our ducks in a row, so we can go in and get the rating that we're hoping for. And as I had shared with this group, and I think the county executive has shared, that hope would be within the next 12 months or so. Sometime late next fall, sometime in 2012 would be a real hope.
What's the cost associated with it?
It runs about $5,000, give or take, depending. I mean, and if you're only going to use one agency or two, that's their cost. There's also cost to whoever's on your team doing your presentation, going and things of that nature. You can go to New York, go to Chicago. Chicago's cheaper. A lot of groups like to go to New York because they think it's flashier, but Chicago makes a lot more sense. And our principal analysts are located in Chicago. It's Midwestern town. They're familiar with Ohio.
And just for way of comment, I do like the idea of setting some parameters on how we, as a council, move forward and making a determination on how far we dip into our reserves. The process that we've been using now, and I applaud the work of our chairman and everyone involved, including all the directors that have come and presented, but to some degree, I guess you'll always have this, and with me being new to being on the legislative body, I imagine those that are more experienced in this have been doing this for years, but a lot of times I get the feeling that the requests that we hear that go above either what the executive has proposed or even what council has an expectation of is dependent upon who's doing, how aggressively someone is campaigning for their cause. So we've heard a lot of people come in and present, but there's been no real determinations on what are the specific priorities that we have, that we know if we are going to dip into reserves, if we do have a surplus of spending, how do we make that determination of, okay, we've got this money and we're going to do something with it. How do we have a strategy behind making the determination on what areas specifically do we see the most need in the county that we should direct that funding for? So far, it's been kind of, I would say more so based on, I don't want to necessarily say individual needs, but where people have seen individual priorities, individual relationships that they may have had with specific agencies is where you see a bigger push. And there's not an overall, in my opinion, strategic focus around, okay, we're going to make a determination on this is how low we'll go into our reserves. And these are the areas where we see it's most important to spend reserve funding. So I'm not sure how to get there, but it would make me a lot more comfortable if we could come up with those parameters.
Councilwoman Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in response to Councilman Rogers' comments, I really have to totally disagree, because I don't think we can legislate and define our parameters in legislation on when and how and if we're going to tap into a reserve. Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? There could be a terrible, calamity. There could be their Health and Human Service doesn't pass. The way we do this, I think it's making sausage. It's not pretty, and it changes all the time. And the priorities that we come up with, I think, is what we're doing today. Is this sheet that our chairs provided us with, is all of us in our due diligence have prioritized what we think is important to go forward in the next 2 years. And there's overlap, and sometimes there's not, and the executive's with us on some, and sometimes he's not. And that's our process of creating a budget. It's fluid. It changes, and to confine and define how and if and when we tap into reserve, I think is imprudent, because every day is different. And what we're facing now with the, the weather that we're seeing is every day is a 100-year storm, more than that. So that's just my comment on that. But what my question to you is about the trends that we're looking at. I understand how when we look at ratings, we don't want to see a trend in which we're tapping into a reserve and that reserve is going down and trending down. So can we just, when we present the budget, just start at where we're going to end up? So for example, our chairs has some final places we rest in 2013. So would it be helpful just to make that amount static as a percentage of what we have in our reserves, rather than trending down? You don't have this in front of you, but for example, maybe Councilman Miller can speak to this more specifically, but it appears from what we put together is a drop in our reserve in the general fund in 13 to 29.8%. Is that correct?
Yes.
So would it help if we just started there and stay there?
To the councilwoman through the chair, you wouldn't be starting there, because you're going to have a balance in 2009, 2010, 2011. Is the question, is 29.8% a good percentage if you go to there? I'm not sure I understand.
That's not my question. The question is a trend. And I understand we're looking back to 2009 and 10 and 11, but going forward, I'm assuming they're looking at going forward. And if we cut off the trend of a downward percentage, if we're decreasing the percentage of the reserve in 2012 and 13 and 11 to 13, it goes down, correct? So what I'm asking is, can we just somehow just make that trend static and just keep it static? So from starting in 2012 in this budget, just have it at a certain percentage and have that same percentage at the end of 13. Does that help when we introduce the rating?
To the councilman through the chair, so to build a budget then that we take 29.8 and that's our static, and on the budgets we build going forward.
Well, at least in the next 2 years, because this is when we're presenting our budget to the ratings agencies. And so I'm asking, is it better if we just make it static versus going down between 12 and 13?
I think I better, to the council member through the chair, I think I better understand the question. I don't think there's any magic to a static, because needs are going to go up and down based upon years. You might have a higher need in one year than another, so that's going to drive the balance up or down. But I don't think you want to see a trend that trends down like this. You wouldn't want to see your fund balance trending up either, where it's growing. You just want to see a nice steady trend within a band of 25 to 30%, I think, is really where you want to be. You don't want to go below that 25%. That's a solid percentage. But I don't think you have to be static.
Okay.
You have to be that rigid.
So it won't matter then. I'm just responding to your statement that the trend matters, and I know it does. But in our little individual 2012 to 13 budget, there's a little teeny trickle down in the percent of what our reserve is, and I just wondered if that mattered. And what I'm hearing from you, it probably does not.
I see the small.
Okay,
the small
it's a
trend
small
does not
incremental.
matter.
It's an incremental trend downward.
0.4%.
So this doesn't matter. We have flexibility, is what I'm hearing. Yes.
Correct. Yeah, 0.4% is a small percentage.
Director, a question. The main reason why the general fund balance drops, and it does in the as introduced version as well as the alternative, is that in 2012, the amount of money in other funding uses increases from 28 million to 43 million. Expanding the base of expenditure, and I'm presuming that that has something to do with Medical Mart. Can you explain what that is?
To the chair, I'm going to ask Director Rubino to help me, but you're correct. It's the way we're accounting for activity with the Medical Mart.
Good afternoon, Matt Rubino, Office of Budget Management. Mr. Chairman, you're partly correct in your assertion, but just to offset that, we're reducing expenditures in the miscellaneous category. MedMart was funded last year. This year, we have a low amount of debt service. It's only about 18.9 million. The operating payments that flow out of the county to channel those operating sources to the project are in the $28 million range, maybe a little less. Next year, we'll have the full impact of the debt service, which is 31 plus million. That'll show up in the other use line, but there'll be an offsetting decrease in the miscellaneous expenditure line of that roll-up report, that general fund roll-up report. From year to year, beginning next year, we're sending approximately $42 or $43 million in total from the county's general fund, from sources dedicated to the project construction fund, and for operating payments to the developer. So it's coming into the general fund and flowing out of the general fund. That's static. Starting next year, that amount is fairly static. Any revenue realized over and above those required payments, debt service and operating payments to the developer, anything over that amount, the county can make a decision what to do with it. We can supplement the construction fund, make a cash contribution. We can hold it in reserve on our side of the ledger and use it for paying down debt in the future, for accumulating a capital reserve fund, because we're going to own the facility at the end of the lease in 2027. And as Jeff Applebaum had described to you in the previous update, there could be some contingency type expenditures that occur when the facility opens in 2013. So those are key points. But we're not spending any additional dollars beginning next year on the MedMart. They're classified differently because of the way the first year debt was structured on that funding.
Okay, the reason why I bring that up, and by the way, that's on page Roman numeral 2-3, just under the middle shaded column in case anybody's checking their budget book. And I just bring that up because it does change the calculation of the reserve percentage, but it's regarding an item that doesn't have anything to do with how many general operating programs we're funding. So I just bring that to everybody's attention. The second thing that I'd like to say is that I would be concerned about the notion that we should wait until we see if the levy's approved. Because the history is that the levy is passed every time it's come up but one. And the one time that it failed, it was then resubmitted and passed before the money was needed. So there has been absolutely no history of any disruption from failure to pass the levy. And the further issue is that if the word got out that even if you pass the levy, that money might not get spent on urgently needed services because we're maintaining artificially high reserve requirements, I don't think that would help pass the levy. So we have to keep that in balance. The third thing that I'd like to mention before I pass this on is that in the starting point set of recommendations for the general fund, those recommendations are dominated by three items. The first is that there's a recommendation to create a new $2 million reserve in order to pay for the enterprise IT items as recommended by Director Mowry. Since currently there's one list of the capital improvement IT items, and then there's the other list of these enterprise items which are of a more operational nature, and we have the automation reserve, but that would adequately fund only one or the other. The second major item is the regional crime lab, which is the administration's proposal of $150,000 in 2012 and $500,000 in 2013. And the third item is the disparity study, which is $400,000. Each of these are one-time items. They're specific things of a long-term nature, not adding staff or creating ongoing programs. And if you back out those three items, the total general fund requests amount to a couple $100,000 in a $350 million budget. So I just bring that to everybody's attention, that the ongoing operational requests for the general fund are quite small. Councilman Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I purposely sat back, and I'm wearing this unforgivable hat because I lost a bet Saturday night. But we pay our debts in Strongsville. But I do go back. I've sat back and listened, and these are all good questions. And the reason I sat back and listened is because I've gone through this. And in the city in which I came, we were mirror images of what Cuyahoga County is today, and then we moved into a AAA. And some of the questions that the council's asking were some of the questions that we had. And it seemed to me that in the different world of bonding and ratings, the thing that they're most interested in is your debt and your debt service. And is the elected body not just willing to raise taxes, but are they willing to set a level of spending to control your spending and what your reserves are? What Mr. Greenspan says, I think, would be the most important thing is, and what I also recommended, is that we set that level, whatever it is. I thought 25% was solid because our experts here say 25% is solid. If 15% is solid on the HHS side, then that's solid. Then we move forward into different discussions. And those discussions then become a little bit different than what the plain dealer wrote about, as opposed to, well, they're on a spending spree. No, you've set your limit of savings. You've set a control mechanism. If indeed something happens within those savings, you have to go in for a replenishment action. We would then protect it. And this isn't just us. This is for future councils also. That would leave a substantial amount of money for further discussions. And indeed, if we choose to have them now going forward this year and next, or 2012, 2013, as far as spending goes. We also have the ability to come back in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months to reinvestigate where we're at and the needs in which people are going to have. And people are going to have needs, and we're going to adjust this. We're going to adjust this probably 5-6 times, I would imagine, as we go forward through this 2-year period. So what I would suggest that we have right now is the discussion on what the levels are in the reserve, and I would recommend a 25-15. From what I've heard are solid numbers. That takes that off the table. We put that into an ordinance form, and then we go into discussions about who needs what, because the money's sitting there. And we're quite honestly talking about a substantial amount of money. And as I sat here and listened to all the directors come through, the one person that comes to my mind, the one individual that hit the home run with me was Dr. Ryan. And his point was, I got a 5-year levy. I stretched it to 10. And the reason I could stretch it to 10 is because we have money, but we didn't necessarily spend it until we needed it. And I think we should all take pause and listen to the words of Dr. Ryan and understand what he did with his levy,
stretching it to 10, the promises that he made, I think we can do that. So I think we're on a good route. I think we're moving in the right direction, but I think we need to right now substantiate those numbers and then have the discussion on spending. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You should wear that hat more often. You've never sounded more intelligent. It's unbelievable. It's like a different person.
And I've never felt more dirty.
Okay, well, we've been going for 2 hours. I think it's time that we have a short break. I thank the director for your insight and help on this, and we're gonna break until 10 after 3, and then we're gonna come back and get into the weeds on the specific proposals for changes in the county budget.